Okay, abusuya ɛyɛ lawyer Tsatsu Tsikata wababɔnten ɛde nsɛm bi ababɛto dwa ɛfa galamsey a ɛkyɛ sɛ NPP foɔ ne mount pressure on ɛyɛ President Mahama sɛ on declare ɛyɛ state of emergency. Abusuya lawyer Tsatsu Tsikata saa mmaranim ne kɛseɛ wei ɔtwerɛ a ɔsɛ galamsey no time a ɛgye nsɛmu ɛwɔ Ghana ha sei no na ɛyɛ Akuffo Addo time. 8 years ago, and galamsey no ɛyɛ kɛse na Akuffo Addo ɛma ne nkɔɔfoɔ a ɔmo bɛn no licenses okreti licenses bi ɛde ma ɔmo ɛte si ɛyɛ Ghana yɛ forest reserve no mu na uti lawyer ne nsɛm a ɔka ɔkyerɛ John Dramani Mahama, president of Ghana, ɔkyerɛ ne sɛ saa nkɔɔfoɔ no a ɔmo yɛ involved in galamsey no ɔmo Akuffo Addo ɛhwɛ ma ɔmo tu galamsey no ɔmo nyinaa yɛ sɛ ɔhodi ɔmo responsible na ɔmo face law no na Akuffo Addo no ɛyɛ NPP foɔ naa na ɔmo saa ɛyɛ licenses no ma ɔmo de tu galamsey ɛsɛ yɛ forest and so sɛ yɛ nsuo nti no ɔno deɛ ɔda ɛyɛ President Mahama sɛ ɔnhwɛ na ɔnhodi saa nkɔɔfoɔ no na wanhodi saa nkɔɔfoɔ no a abusua ɛnyɛ papa nti no ɛkyɛ sɛ wahyeki NPP foɔ no watɔ pressure bi ɛde ama NPP foɔ sɛ President Mahama ɛnhwɛ na kyɛ sɛ ɔnyɛ saa nkɔɔfoɔ no adwuma mama yɛnkɔ na yɛnkɔ tie nsɛm a lawyer Tsatsu Tsikata ɛde to dwa ɔnsubscribe yɛ subscribe like na share ma afoforɔ nso nsa ntumi ɛnka bi aha ɛyɛ Ghana politics abɛni so medamase.
I just talked about the fact that we started this whole thing with illegal mining. And it's been 1 year down the line. We are still grappling with this issue. Now even debating as to whether or not we should declare a state of emergency. Why are we where we are?
Well, it's a shame indeed that we are where we are. But I think there's some hard facts that we've got to face. One is that clearly there are vested interests that are protecting the whole situation that we find ourselves in. There are vested interests which are trying to prevent any serious combating of what we publicly are recognizing is an untenable situation. I mean, you ask yourself, if we all proclaim that this is something terrible, why is it that there's still some people who are able to get away with, mining in forest areas, illegal, mining in various parts of the country? I mean, clearly, some of these people have felt protected politically, for instance. And again, I think we need to call a spade a spade. I mean, in the last 8 years, you look at the number of licenses that were granted for mining, including mining in these forest areas and so on. And it doesn't make sense. I mean, if you were saying a year ago, you were raising issues, alarms about this, why was it possible, even just before the handover to a new government that had been elected, in the December election, why was it possible for so many new licenses to be granted? Why? You ask yourself.
You talk about in the last 8 years, but you do understand that even before the last 8 years, galamsey was still rampant.
I understand that. All I'm pointing out is that we are talking about continued galamsey activities, even in the face of us all agreeing as a country that this is doing a lot of damage. Yes, it's been there, but the scale of it in the last year has been extraordinary. I mean, your colleagues, investigative journalists, have been, exposing some of these things. Everybody is talking about it. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that it's a new problem. I'm saying that the scale of the problem has been extraordinary, and it would not have reached these levels if it did not have the backing of powerful vested interests.
And I want to get your preliminary thought as well. I realize you are reacting to what Mr. Puku was saying.
Well, I'm not indulging in any kind of a blame game when I point out that the scale of galamsey activity escalated in the last 8 years. That's just a fact. Let's face it. The scale of pollution of water bodies, the scale of destruction of forests, the scale of cocoa farms being turned over to illegal mining activity escalated. People in the cocoa sector, reference this as part of the reason why Ghana's cocoa production dropped dramatically in the last couple of years. These are facts.
So this is what...
So let me be clear that I've not even begun to blame anybody yet. Of course, if there's blame to be, allotted to people, it has to be allotted. But I hadn't begun yet. All I had started talking about was the escalation. And it is that escalation which has led to the proliferation, for instance, of arms that you talk about. In the past, in times when people were doing small-scale mining in Akuffo and so on, they didn't have the scale of arms, the sophistication. So you must be the first to recognize when one is talking about an escalation, that's where we are now. It's an escalated situation, and therefore, it is now a matter of national security. That's where we are now. And
we'll go into that bit about the declaration of a state of national security or declaring areas that are infested with illegal mining as national security zones, but about the laws we have. Because when it comes to the laws, we have perhaps adequate to protect our environment from degradation and destruction. But it is the fact that perhaps the law is overrated, because the law in itself, without action, cannot help solve the problem.
No, I would agree.
How do you...
I would agree with that. And I think, a lot of the time, people talk as if once you make some legal adjustments here and there, once you declare a state of emergency or whatever, you'll solve the problem. That's far from the case. And I would completely agree that, we shouldn't focus just on laws. We should focus on the nature of the problem. And in my view, that's where vested interests come. You see, if you have a lot of people who feel that there is value in something and who are going after it by hook or by crook, they will try to protect the position that they're in every way possible. So that makes it more difficult for the enforcement action. We lost a whole military major, because the military were put to work in relation to a situation involving illegal mining. Now, so we can't run away from the fact that you have these vested interests. And if we are not willing to assess the graduation of vested interest from one period to another, and it's not just about political parties in power that we should be interested in, but even if we talk about it in terms of periods, we have to identify the way these vested interests protect their positions, which makes it more difficult to enforce. So enforcement is a problem. And it becomes more problematic when you have these vested interests very sort of entrenched in powerful positions.
We have to identify the source of the vested interest. I know you've been monitoring the situation as well, and I'll come back to you very shortly, Mr. Ikutu. What have you yourself identified, which is why we are where we are?
Well, it's quite clear to me. When you look at the award of licenses, which Mr. Ikutu doesn't want you to talk about, the reality is that a lot of licenses were awarded to, people who were closely connected with those in power, those who had the opportunity, those who had the authority to grant licenses. That's the reality. We can't run away from it.
Mr. Ikoto, how do you, in the Emergency Powers Act 1994, Act 472, we'll go into that, but I want you, Mr. Tsikata, to respond briefly to what Mr. Ikoto said earlier, that indeed, before the 2024 general election, there were officials, top officials of the NDC, including the now sitting president, who were, making the pronouncement that they were going to be very tough on illegal mining. In fact, there's an article which was published exactly on the 9th of September 2025, where the president met some religious leaders and said that, yes, dealing with galamsey would be a formidable challenge, but it demands strong political will. The concerns of a lot of people is that, yes, you're just 9 months into power, but you don't seem to have had the strong will enough to deal with this situation head-on, as you made us believe ahead of the 2024 general election.
Well, I'm not a spokesperson.
Certainly, but
I'm not a spokesperson for any of the people who may have made utterances. But I want us to just assess the facts that are a matter of public knowledge. Those facts include the reality that has just been explained, that virtually all over Ghana, there's illegal mining activity. So there is a scale of the problem which, has to be taken into consideration. Now, in taking that into consideration, I mean, Mr. Poku mentioned the availability of military or other personnel, security personnel to cope with the situation and so on. But you see, I think that is looking at it too narrowly from the perspective of just enforcement action, because something of this nature can't be dealt with by just deploying troops or by just, and that's why in my mind, if you just started, I mean, it would be the easiest thing for the president to say, I'm declaring a state of emergency because of galamsey. That's a proclamation he can make under the constitutional and the statutory provisions.
yes.
But even after you make that declaration, how are you going to implement your enforcement capabilities? And what is the capacity that you have, both in terms of even the state of the economy that we have, the resources that are available to the government, to be able to deploy in that manner? But I think there's an even more severe problem that we should deal with. You see, declaring a state of emergency, and you will notice that in the Constitution, emergency powers are dealt with in the chapter that has to do with human rights. When you declare a state of emergency, it actually gives the power to the president to do things which in the normal course he would not have the ability to do. So I think that people should be very careful in some of these demands about a state of emergency and so on. Because you ask yourself, do you really want the executive, the president, to have unusual powers that he can use, in respect of a state of emergency? In my view, honestly, I can't see a real justification for just making a declaration of a state of emergency and assuming that through that you will have satisfied people that you're giving urgent consideration to galamsey.
So let me read that a bit of the Emergency Powers Act 1994, Act 472. And when you look at Article 31 and 32 of the 1992 Constitution, you seem to have similar writings as well. So just a bit of that. Section 1 says, declaration of a state of emergency. The president may, acting in accordance with the advice of the Council of State, by proclamation published in the Gazette, declare that a state of emergency exists in Ghana or in any part of Ghana. Section 2 says Parliament has to be informed, and then Parliament shall within 72 hours after being so notified decide whether the proclamation should remain in force or should be revoked, and the President shall act in accordance with the decision of Parliament. And it says Section 3, talking about the duration of a state of emergency, says 1, a declaration of a state of emergency shall cease to have effect at the expiration of a period of 7 days, beginning with the date of publication of the declaration, unless before the expiration of that period it is approved by resolution passed for that purpose by a majority of all the members of Parliament. And then when you look at the subject to the subsection 2 of section 4, declaration of state emergency approved by resolution of Parliament shall continue in force until the expiration of a period of 3 months, beginning with the date of it being so approved. You talked about the consequences of declaring a state of emergency, and I just wanted to just go through that, and I'll go back to Mr. Francis Poku, because you seem to disagree with those who are asking for the declaration of a state of emergency because perhaps they may not necessarily know the effects it may have when indeed that is done. Okay, I will have to look for that, but it is also within that. It says where a person is restricted or detained pursuant to declaration of a state of emergency, the following provisions shall apply. So it restricts movement of people, deployment of security agencies and all of that. But again, I was referring to Article 31, which really tells you that when there is a natural disaster or something that the country finds as a crisis, and it deprives people of their right to certain amenities, then there should be that declaration of a state of emergency. So you wouldn't agree with what Mr. Francis Poku said, that indeed this has become an existential threat. And looking at even what our constitution says, we should be able to do that.
No, it can be an existential threat, but the way to deal with an existential threat is not necessarily to declare a state of emergency, because when you declare a state of emergency, it is to enable you to do something which you would not otherwise have been able to do. So if you can deploy, troops or whatever, or if you can engage community, if you can engage, the nation as a whole, if you can mobilize community support against galamsey, but there have been important things done. Look, let's not behave as if nothing has been done in the effort to deal with galamsey. There has been a decisive intervention in relation to some of this mining in forest areas, for instance. There's been an end brought to some of the activities. It's been visible. People who were engaged in it have been stopped. There has been a process of seizing excavators and so on for people undertaking mining in protected forest areas, which they were not entitled to do. And, there's a process now, for instance, of trying to register the excavators, ensure that you can track them wherever they may be deployed and so on. So, steps are being taken. Of course, the society rightly believes that the steps are not sufficient, but they're not sufficient because of the scale of the problem and because of the way that some people want to keep it going. If you have a problem which, only a few people are interested in protecting, it's easier to focus on attacking the problem around those few people. But if you have a problem which a lot of people are engaged in creating for you, then you really got to sit back and make sure that the measures that you're taking are going to be effective. It's not a matter of just declaring a state of emergency.
So when you say that the way some people, and I'll be coming back to you, Mr. Ikutu, very shortly, and Mr. Francis Poku as well, when you say that we are not perhaps seeing progress, just putting it in my own words, because some people want to keep it happening, would you say that some of those people are currently in government? Because again, Mr. Ikutu also talked about the revocation of LI 2462, and it looks like the government has been dancing about the bush regarding revoking this. Let me just read a bit of that to you.
Well,
Section
2. I've looked at LI 2462 very carefully, and the issues about LI 2462 are again, not central, frankly, to the dealing with galamsey all around the country. The forest areas, the forest reserve problem is, again, a heightening of the problem. I won't say escalation so as not to upset anybody. But, the fact that people can even get into forest reserves just shows you that this has now got to just an extraordinary level. But again, we have been witness to, a forestry commission led by somebody who could, with impunity, talk about areas of the forest being, his and his generations thereafter. So,
you mean Sir John, the late Sir John?
Well, I mean, no names mentioned, but he who the cup fits should wear it. But look, I feel that the public is entitled to ask questions of everybody, to ask for accountability, whether it's today's president or yesterday's president. Accountability is important in this task because you're dealing with a situation in which you're calling on the highest officers in the land to take drastic action. But you can't also just demand from them that they take an action which seems drastic on the surface. You declare a state of emergency is drastic. But in fact, it may be counterproductive to the solution that you need because just giving, powers to a president to be able to limit the rights of people and so on is not always the best way to go. And I have to say that I think sometimes people should be careful what they wish for.
Ms. Aikwetu, how do you respond briefly to what Mr. Tsikata is saying? And then we'll go into the LI 2462.
Well, I mean, I think it is important that the president's clarity about a political will to confront the situation has been communicated. And that's why I said earlier, people should be held accountable. So the president should be held accountable for his declaration of a commitment to confront the problem. Regardless of whether somebody alleges that somebody in his party or somebody in some other party is involved, the president says he wants to confront the situation. So starting from there, we know that there is a certain leadership commitment. But leadership commitment is not only about the president. Leadership commitment is also at the level of the communities themselves. For instance, chiefs and, other sort of local leaders, have a certain stake in the situation we're dealing with. It's not for people in Accra all the time to pretend that they know everything that's happening on the ground. Even if the intelligence agencies pick up information and relay it, still, the people on the ground in the communities must also have a certain commitment to the fight. And in that regard, I completely agree with the observation made that when we are talking about alternative jobs and so on and so forth, we've got to ensure that these young people can feel attracted to the alternatives. Some of these areas were areas where cocoa used to be farmed.
Indeed.
But they were moved to what seemed to be a more lucrative, gold mining sort of opportunity. So the issue is, how are we going to encourage some of these young people who find an easier route, through gold and doing the illegal thing? How are we going to encourage them to do differently? Now, that encouragement cannot all come from just a central leader.
And say, if you could wrap up in like 30 seconds for us.
That encouragement has to come from their families and groups around them. So, I mean, it's a nationwide mobilization.
Nationwide mobilization, Mr. Aikwetu.
Okay, I was aware and some so our political highway. So a lawyer can see and I had in Castle or this and some at the air to Jade Amaya Siciano, NPP for a be Ababatom so and Asam Ketuakra, lawyer Tsatsu or you be or can a womb, the Waka and a President Mahama. Yabama so much a penny, Coco Tisa and some way at my Ghana Politics Avenues. And don't forget to click on the notification bell so that any updates be a drop piano. Once a bit to me, Akabi, Madam.